A couple of weeks ago, here at the Abbey, we had a course on grief. It was a weekend course. It was originally intended to be a residential course, but some of us were still testing positive for COVID, so it ended up being an online course. And I've never taught a course on this topic before. I've taught lots of courses on the subject of death and dying, how to prepare for death, how to help people who are dying. But grief is something I'd never talked about before. And there aren't really, at least that I have found, teachings in the traditional Buddhist collection of teachings specifically on grief, what it is, how to deal with it, antidotes to it, and so on. So I spent about a week just doing research and pulling things out from different sources, some from Buddhist teachings, but also some from the contemporary Western psychology and medical profession and so on. So I managed to put together quite a bit of information. And it was just a very short course, but the plan is to have a longer one, maybe longer, but another one that can be residential next year. So one of the first things I talked about in the course was what are called the 5 contemplations, or they're also called the 5 remembrances. And these were taught by the Buddha in a sutra. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but it looks like Upajjhatthana Sutra in the Pali Canon. And quite a few Buddhists are aware of these and practice them on a regular basis. And in the sutra, the Buddha said it's very good for people, both men and women, monastic, lay people, to reflect on these often. And so the first 3 are basically remembering that we're going to get old. In fact, we are growing old, and there's no way to avoid that. That we're going to experience sickness. There's no way we can avoid that. And that we're going to die. There's no way to avoid that. So basically remembering that we are subject to aging and sickness and death. And then the 4th one is about our cherished possessions and loved ones, that they are subject to change, and inevitably, eventually, we will have to separate from them. The 5th one is about karma, that we are the owner of our karma, and so on. That whole idea that the actions that we do bring results that we will experience in the future. And in the sutra, the Buddha said that if we don't reflect on these, the danger is that we may end up creating misconduct of body, speech, and mind. Because he said for the first 3, we can get intoxicated with youth, intoxicated with health, intoxicated with life. And under the influence of these intoxications, we can create negative karma. Well, he said misconduct of body, speech, and mind. So that probably rings a bell, right? Especially the first one, intoxicated with youth. But then on the other hand, if we do reflect on these regularly, then that will diminish such intoxication and diminish misconduct that we create. And with the 4th one, he says we tend to have desire, attachment to our things and our loved ones and so on. And that can also lead to misconduct of body, speech, and mind. And so contemplating the fact that we're going to separate from everyone and everything will help to diminish that desire and diminish misconduct. So I think that contemplating, especially these first 4, can help with grief. It will help us to have less grief to begin with, because I think most people don't really want to think about these things. They don't want to think about the fact that they're going to get old and sick and die and have to separate from family and friends and all their things. You know, people avoid thinking about those things. And I think that's one reason why there's so much grief, because we never think about these things. We don't want to think about things. And Buddhism talks about grasping at permanence, this sort of conception that we have of seeing things as permanent. It's more like wishful thinking, because it's definitely not reality. That our loved ones are going to be there forever, that we're going to be there forever. So that's definitely not reality. And so, yeah, Buddha pointed out we have this tendency to grasp at things that are actually impermanent, but grasping them as permanent, wanting them to be there forever. So under the influence of that distorted conception, which is also a kind of affliction, then when we do face loss of our health, loss of our young body, loss of our life, loss of loved ones, and so on, it's unbearable. So the more we resist contemplating these things, then I think the greater will be the grief that we experience when we do face them. And on the other hand, if we do contemplate these points and just get familiar with them as we go through life, then that will soften the blow when we do face these experiences of loss. So we'll probably still feel a certain amount of grief, but probably much less than if we never contemplate these points. So I think that these 5 remembrances or 5 contemplations recommended by the Buddha are very helpful to reduce that painful experience of grief. So we did a meditation on these. We also had some nice discussion. And there was one question that came up that I thought was interesting. It was actually our friend Tukche who asked, is grief an affliction? And clearly it's not on the list of root and secondary afflictions that we normally study. In our tradition, we have 6 root afflictions and 20 secondary afflictions. And grief is not on either of those lists. But then I looked in this big book, which is Volume 2 of Science and Philosophy in the Indian Buddhist Classics. This is all about the mind. It has quite a few details that you don't always find in other books on the topic of mind and mental factors. And so it has some additional lists of secondary afflictions that we don't normally encounter. And these, it seems like they're originally taught by the Buddha in a Vinaya text called The Finer Points of Discipline. And based on that text and then Indian commentaries, there's one list of 24 secondary afflictions, one of which is grief. And there's also a list of 77 secondary afflictions that are explained in one text by a Sangha called Compendium of Bases, and grief is on that list as well. So it seems that grief is a secondary affliction, although maybe not one of the major ones. That's why we normally study a list of 20 secondary afflictions. But still, the fact that it was mentioned by the Buddha as an affliction is something to consider. And I think that, to put this into practice, when we do find ourselves experiencing grief, to use mindfulness and introspective awareness and watch what's going on in our mind. There'll probably be a lot of different things, different thoughts, different emotions, memories, associations, and so on. And just look out for afflictions, because I think there are recognizable afflictions that can come up, like attachment. That's probably the main one. This I don't want to lose that person. I want that person to stay there forever, or whatever it is that we're experiencing the loss of. It isn't just people, but it can also be loss of a job, loss of our youth, loss of our health, loss of anything. Many different ways that we can experience loss. So attachment is probably a big factor in our unhappiness when we face loss. So attachment, look for attachment, and then apply antidotes for attachment. And I think sometimes anger can happen as well. People may feel angry at the person who passed away, like, how could you leave me? How could you do this to me? Or anger at people we might think were responsible for this person passing away. So anger is another affliction that might arise. So I think that's a useful approach, is to just pay attention to our mind and try to recognize if there are afflictions happening, and if so, then apply antidotes to them. And then finally, on the last day, I talked about how we can use the methods from Lojong, or thought transformation. There's a whole section of teachings on transforming problems into the path, or transforming suffering into the path, something like that. So there's lots of different methods that we can use when we do face a problem, a difficulty such as grief, and make use of that experience, like kind of like recycling it and turning it into something beneficial, and part of our spiritual practice. So, for example, compassion. Having that experience of grieving is very, very painful. And we can contemplate how I'm not the only one in the world who has this experience. And in fact, this is what the Buddha mentioned in this sutra. Now, in addition to thinking about how we are subject to these experiences, we can also think everyone else is subject to aging, sickness, dying, and loss, and so on. And so that helps us open our hearts to others, and have more compassion for them, which is a very important part of the path. And also facing whatever distorted conceptions, delusions we have in our mind, and dealing with them, overcoming them, will help us to grow our wisdom. So there's a number of different, I don't have time now, but lots of different methods in that particular area or body of teachings, transforming problems into the path, whereby we can transform this experience of grief. So it isn't just a horrible, bad experience, but it can be a catalyst for, spiritual practice, spiritual growth, and help us grow in our compassion and our wisdom. So like I say, this was just an experimental course, trying out something we hadn't done before, but I think we learned a lot, and people really appreciated the course, and we will try to do another one next year. Thank you.